Amy had always believed in fairy tales. Growing up, she dreamed of finding her Prince Charming, getting married, and living happily ever after. When she met Richard at a coffee shop 8 years ago, she thought her dreams had come true. He was everything she had imagined: tall, handsome, successful, and charming. Richard owned a growing construction company and seemed to have his whole life figured out. Their first few years together were magical. Richard would surprise her with flowers, take her to fancy restaurants, and tell her how lucky he was to have found someone like her. Amy was working as a third-grade teacher at the time, something she absolutely loved. She enjoyed seeing the spark in children's eyes when they learned something new. Her students adored her, and their parents often praised her dedication. When Richard proposed after 2 years of dating, Amy felt like the luckiest woman alive. The wedding was beautiful, held at an expensive venue with over 200 guests. All of Richard's business friends came, and everyone talked about what a perfect couple they made. Amy felt like a princess in her white dress, and Richard looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. After they got married, Richard's business started growing rapidly. He was getting bigger contracts, hiring more workers, and making more money than Amy had ever imagined possible. They bought a beautiful house in an upscale neighborhood with 5 bedrooms, a huge kitchen, and a perfectly manicured lawn. Amy loved decorating their new home and making it feel warm and welcoming. About 3 years into their marriage, Richard started asking Amy to consider leaving her teaching job. He said he was making enough money for both of them, and wouldn't it be nice if she could focus on taking care of their home? Amy was hesitant at first because she loved teaching, but Richard kept insisting. He said successful men's wives didn't need to work, and it would look better for his business image if she could be available for company events and entertaining clients. Finally, Amy agreed to quit teaching. She told herself it was temporary, and that maybe they would start a family soon. Richard seemed so happy with her decision, and Amy wanted to support her husband's dreams just like he had supported hers. She spent her last day at school saying goodbye to her students, promising to visit them soon. At first, staying home wasn't too bad. Amy enjoyed having time to cook elaborate meals, keep the house spotless, and tend to her garden. She volunteered at the local library and helped with community events. When Richard came home from work, dinner was always ready and the house was perfect. He seemed appreciative and would often brag to his friends about how well Amy took care of everything, but something started changing in their 4th year of marriage. Richard's business was doing incredibly well, and he was spending more time with wealthy clients and business partners. He started coming home later, talking more about money and success, and seemed less interested in Amy's day or her thoughts about things. The first time, Richard made a comment that hurt Amy's feelings. She thought it was just a bad day. They were having dinner with one of his business partners and the man's wife. When the other woman asked Amy about her work, Richard laughed and said, "Amy doesn't work anymore. She's basically my personal assistant at home." Amy smiled awkwardly, but inside she felt embarrassed. The way he said it made her feel small and unimportant. As months passed, these comments became more frequent. When Richard's friends came over to watch football games, he would joke about how Amy was like having a live-in maid. If someone complimented the delicious food Amy prepared, Richard would say things like, "Well, she better be good at something since she doesn't work." Amy would laugh along, but each comment felt like a small cut to her heart. The worst part was how Richard acted when his wealthy clients visited their home for business meetings. Amy would spend hours preparing everything perfectly, cleaning the house until it sparkled, preparing gourmet snacks, and making sure she looked presentable. But instead of introducing her as his wife, Richard would often say things like, "This is Amy, she keeps the house running," or "Amy here makes sure everything is taken care of." It was as if he was ashamed to call her his wife in front of these important people. Amy started noticing that Richard treated her differently when they were alone versus when they were around his business associates. When it was just the two of them, he was generally kind, though not as romantic as he used to be. But when his successful friends were around, he seemed to enjoy making jokes at her expense. He would ask her to serve drinks and snacks like she was hired help, and when she tried to join conversations, he would change the subject or send her to the kitchen for something. One evening, Amy tried talking to Richard about how his comments made her feel. She chose her words carefully, explaining that she felt hurt when he introduced her as anything other than his wife. Richard seemed genuinely surprised by her concerns. He said she was being too sensitive and that he was just joking around. He reminded her that she had a beautiful home, nice clothes, and didn't have to worry about money. According to him, she should be grateful instead of complaining. About harmless jokes. Amy wanted to believe that Richard didn't mean to hurt her feelings. She convinced herself that maybe she was being too sensitive. After all, she did have a comfortable life, and Richard worked hard to provide for them. Maybe this was just how successful couples talk to each other. She had seen some of Richard's business associates make similar comments about their wives, and those women didn't seem bothered by it. So Amy continued smiling and playing along with Richard's jokes. She continued preparing perfect meals, keeping their house immaculate, and being available whenever Richard needed her to entertain clients or attend business events. But deep inside, she was starting to feel like she was disappearing. The confident teacher who had once inspired children and been respected by colleagues was slowly being replaced by someone who felt like an accessory to her husband's success. Amy told herself that marriage required compromise and that Richard's business success was good for both of them. She pushed down her feelings of hurt and embarrassment, believing that if she just tried harder to be the perfect wife, Richard would start treating her with more respect again. She had no idea that things were about to get much worse and that the man she had married was changing into someone she wouldn't recognize. The invitation arrived on expensive cardstock with gold lettering. Richard's construction company was hosting their annual gala at the city's most prestigious hotel, and this year was special. They were celebrating their biggest year yet, with contracts worth millions of dollars. Richard had been talking about this event for months, telling Amy how important it was for his business and how many influential people would be attending. Amy felt a flutter of excitement when she saw the invitation. Maybe this would be her chance to feel like Richard's equal again, to be introduced proudly as his wife instead of just the help. She had been looking forward to dressing up and being part of Richard's professional world in a meaningful way. For weeks, Amy prepared for the gala like it was the most important night of her life. She spent days shopping for the perfect dress, finally settling on an elegant navy blue gown that made her feel confident and beautiful. She booked appointments at the salon for her hair and makeup, wanting everything to be flawless. Amy even practiced conversation topics in the mirror, preparing to talk with Richard's business associates about their work and interests. The night before the gala, Amy laid out her dress, shoes, and jewelry carefully. She had spent more money on this outfit than she had on clothes in the past 2 years combined, but she felt it was worth it. Richard seemed pleased when he saw her preparations, commenting that she would look great representing his company. Amy went to bed that night feeling hopeful that this evening would mark a turning point in their marriage. On the day of the gala, Amy spent hours getting ready. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, her makeup was perfect, and when she put on her dress, she felt like the woman she used to be before she gave up teaching. Richard looked handsome in his expensive tuxedo, and for a moment Amy remembered why she had fallen in love with him. They looked like a power couple in the mirror, and Amy felt proud to be Richard's wife. The hotel ballroom was absolutely stunning. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Round tables were covered in white linens with gold accents, and fresh flowers decorated every surface. Amy estimated there were at least 200 people in attendance, all dressed in their finest clothes. She recognized some faces from previous company events, but there were many new people she was excited to meet. The first hour of the event went well. Amy mingled with some of the wives she had met before, enjoyed the cocktails and appetizers, and felt comfortable in her beautiful dress. Richard seemed relaxed and happy, introducing her to a few people as "my wife Amy." She began to think that maybe her worries had been unnecessary, and that tonight would be different from those awkward moments at home, but then Richard spotted someone across the room who made his eyes light up with excitement. There's James Peterson, he told Amy excitedly. He owns the biggest development company in the state. I've been trying to get a meeting with him for over a year. This could be the contract that changes everything for us. Amy watched as Richard straightened his tie and checked his appearance one more time. She could see how much this meeting meant to him, and she wanted to be supportive. Go introduce yourself, she encouraged him. I'm sure he'll be impressed with what you've accomplished. Richard smiled and took her arm. Come with me. Having you there will make me look more established and successful. Amy felt a warm glow at his words. Finally, Richard wanted her by his side as his partner, not hidden away in the background. They approached James Peterson, who was standing with a small group of well-dressed men and women. Richard put on his most charming smile and extended his hand. Mr. Peterson, I'm Richard Thompson from Thompson Construction. I've been hoping for a chance to meet you. James Peterson shook Richard's hand with a polite smile. Nice to meet you, Richard. I've heard good things about your company. His eyes moved to Amy and he waited for an introduction. This was the moment Amy had been hoping for all evening. She smiled warmly, ready to be introduced as Richard's wife and partner. But what happened next would be burned into her memory. Forever, Richard glanced at Amy, then back at James Peterson, and said with a casual laugh, This is Amy. She's basically my live-in maid who I keep around for convenience. The words hit Amy like a physical blow. She felt her smile freeze on her face as the small group turned to look at her with surprise and confusion. Amy's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she tried to recover. With a nervous laugh, she extended her hand to James Peterson. Actually, I'm Richard's wife, she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but instead of apologizing or correcting himself, Richard doubled down on his cruel joke. Well, what else would you call someone who just cooks and cleans all day? He said with a laugh that sounded forced and mean. I mean, she doesn't work or contribute anything else, so maid seems about right. The silence that followed was deafening. Amy could feel the eyes of everyone in the small group on her, and she could see a mixture of shock, pity, and secondhand embarrassment on their faces. James Peterson's wife looked horrified, and even James himself seemed uncomfortable with what he had just witnessed. Amy stood there in her beautiful dress, feeling more exposed and humiliated than she had ever felt in her life. This wasn't just happening in their living room with a few friends anymore. This was in front of hundreds of people, including some of the most successful business owners in the city. And Richard had chosen this moment, this important moment, for his career to publicly humiliate her in the worst way possible. Excuse me, Amy managed to whisper, and she turned and walked away as quickly as she could without running. She could hear the uncomfortable murmur of voices behind her as she made her way through the crowded ballroom. Desperately looking for the nearest exit, Amy found herself in the hotel's ladies' room, staring at her reflection in the ornate mirror. The woman looking back at her was perfectly dressed and made up, but her eyes showed a pain that no amount of makeup could hide. She gripped the marble countertop and tried to breathe steadily, fighting back tears that would ruin her carefully. Applied makeup for several minutes. Amy stood alone in that bathroom, replaying what had just happened over and over in her mind. This wasn't just Richard being thoughtless or making a bad joke. This was deliberate cruelty, and he had chosen to display it in front of the most important people in his professional world. He had sacrificed her dignity to make himself look powerful and dominant. When Amy finally returned to the ballroom, she saw Richard laughing and talking with James Peterson like nothing had happened. He didn't even look for her or seem concerned about where she had gone. Amy spent the rest of the evening standing quietly beside him when required, smiling when spoken to, but feeling like she was watching everything happen from outside her own body. The ride home was silent. Richard seemed pleased with how the evening had gone, humming softly to himself as he drove. Amy stared out the window, realizing that the man she had married no longer existed. In his place was someone who saw her as so worthless that he could publicly degrade her without a second thought. That night, as Richard slept peacefully beside her, Amy lay awake staring at the ceiling. 8 years of marriage, and this was what it had come to. She had given up her career, her independence, and her sense of self to support Richard's dreams, and in return, He had turned her into a punchline for his own entertainment. For the first time since their wedding day, Amy began to wonder if their marriage was really worth saving. The days following the gala were the longest of Amy's life. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, replaying Richard's words over and over in her mind. Every time she remembered the shocked faces of those people, her stomach would twist into knots. She had barely slept, barely eaten, and could hardly look at Richard without feeling a mixture of hurt and anger she had never experienced before. Richard, on the other hand, seemed completely unaffected by what had happened. He came home from work each day in a good mood, talking excitedly about new business opportunities that had come from the gala. He mentioned that James Peterson was considering giving him a major contract, and he acted like the evening had been a complete success. It was as if Amy's humiliation had never happened, or worse, as if it simply didn't matter to him. For the first few days, Amy tried to go back to her normal routine. She cooked Richard's favorite meals, kept the house spotless, and attempted to pretend everything was fine. But something fundamental had changed inside her. The rose-colored glasses she had been wearing for years had finally been ripped away, and she was starting to see her life and her marriage with painful clarity. It was on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the gala, that Amy's perspective began to shift completely. Richard had left for work early, rushing out the door with his coffee and briefcase like he did every morning. But this time, instead of immediately starting her usual household tasks, Amy found herself standing in the middle of their living room, really looking at her surroundings for the first time in years. Everything in their beautiful home was chosen by Richard or bought with Richard's money. The expensive furniture, the artwork on the walls, even most of Amy's clothes. Richard had opinions about all of it. Amy realized she couldn't remember the last time she had made a decision about anything important in their lives. She had become so focused on being the perfect wife that she had stopped being herself entirely. That afternoon, Richard called and asked Amy to organize his home office. This was something he requested periodically when his paperwork got too messy for him to find important documents. Usually, Amy would quickly sort through everything, putting papers in neat piles and filing things away without really paying attention to what they were. But this time was different. As Amy began organizing Richard's desk, she found herself actually reading the documents instead of just sorting them. Most of it was typical business paperwork, contracts, invoices, employee information. But then she came across a folder that made her pause. It was labeled Personal Legal and contained correspondence with a law firm she didn't recognize. Amy's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. The first few letters were about routine legal matters, but then she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a letter from Richard to his lawyer, dated just 3 months ago, discussing preparation for potential divorce proceedings. Amy sank into Richard's leather chair, staring at the letter in disbelief. Richard had been planning to divorce her for months, and she had no idea. But what made it even worse was the content of the letter. Richard had written about his strategy to minimize any alimony payments by claiming that Amy had made no significant contributions to their marriage or his business success. In his own words, Richard had described Amy as unemployed by choice and lacking any marketable skills or financial contributions. He had even suggested to his lawyer that Amy's decision to quit teaching showed she was unmotivated and dependent, making her undeserving of long-term financial support. Amy felt sick to her stomach as she read how coldly and strategically Richard had been planning to destroy her life. This wasn't a recent decision made in anger after a fight. This was calculated, planned, and cruel. He had been living with her, accepting her care and support, all while secretly preparing to discard her and leave her with nothing. But Amy's discoveries were far from over. As she continued going through the files, now with a new sense of urgency and determination, she found evidence of financial accounts she had never heard of. Richard had been moving money into offshore accounts and investments that were in his name only. He had been systematically hiding their assets to make it look like he had far less money than he actually did. The more Amy dug, the more horrified she became. Richard had even gone so far as to create fake expenses and debts to make his business appear less profitable than it really was. He had been preparing to claim poverty in their divorce while secretly maintaining millions of dollars. In hidden assets, Amy's teacher instincts kicked in as she began organizing and documenting everything she found. She had always been good at research and analysis, skills that had served her well in education, and that she now realized could serve her in a very different way. She started making copies of important documents, taking photos with her phone, and creating a detailed timeline of Richard's deceptive activities, but the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Hidden in the back of a filing cabinet, Amy found a folder labeled Charitable Contributions. At first, she assumed it contained tax documents related to Richard's business donations. His company regularly contributed to local charities, and Richard often spoke publicly about his commitment to giving back to the community. However, as Amy examined the documents more closely, she realized something was terribly wrong. The numbers didn't add up. According to the public records and tax documents, Richard's company had donated over $500,000 to a children's education charity over the past 2 years. But the actual receipts and internal documents showed that only a fraction of that money had ever reached the charity. Amy spread the documents across Richard's desk, her hands shaking as she pieced together what had been happening. Richard had been stealing from the charity fund, using most of the money for his personal investments while claiming the full amount as a tax deduction. The charity that was supposed to help underprivileged children get better educational opportunities had been robbed by her own husband. This discovery hit Amy particularly hard because of her background in education. She knew how desperately schools and educational programs needed funding. She had seen firsthand how much difference extra resources could make in a child's life. The thought that Richard had been stealing money meant to help children learn and grow made her feel physically ill. Amy realized she was looking at evidence of serious criminal activity. This wasn't just a bad husband planning a sneaky divorce. This was fraud, embezzlement, and theft from a children's charity. Richard had been presenting himself as a generous philanthropist while actually stealing from the very cause he claimed to support. As Amy sat surrounded by the evidence of Richard's crimes and betrayals, she felt something shift inside her. The hurt and confusion she had been feeling since the gala began to transform into something else entirely. She wasn't just angry about how Richard had treated her anymore. She was furious about what he had done to those children who needed help, about the charity workers who thought they had a generous benefactor, and about all the people Richard had been deceiving for years. For the first time since their marriage, Amy felt like she had a purpose beyond being Richard's perfect wife. She had uncovered something that could destroy Richard's reputation and his business, but more importantly, it could help ensure that justice was served for his victims. Amy carefully put all the documents back exactly where she had found them, but not before making copies of everything. She spent the rest of the afternoon acting normal, cooking dinner and greeting Richard with her usual smile when he came home. But inside, her mind was racing with possibilities. That night, as Richard slept peacefully beside her, completely unaware that his secrets had been discovered, Amy stared at the ceiling and began planning her next moves. She wasn't just going to leave Richard or divorce him quietly. She was going to make sure everyone knew exactly who he really was. The woman Richard had called a maid was about to become his worst nightmare. Over the next 3 weeks, Amy transformed into someone she barely recognized. The quiet, submissive wife who had been cooking and cleaning without question was replaced by a woman with a mission. Every day while Richard was at work, Amy spent hours carefully planning what would become the most important evening of both their lives. The first step was reaching out to people who could help her understand the full scope of Richard's crimes. Amy contacted the children's education charity that Richard had been stealing from, pretending to be a potential donor interested in learning more about their programs. During a phone conversation with the charity director, Amy carefully asked about their recent donations and was heartbroken to learn how desperately they needed the funds that Richard had stolen. Amy also spent time researching Richard's business, partners and clients. She looked up their companies online, read about their values and reputations, and began to understand that many of these people would be horrified to learn they were associated with someone who stole from children's charities. These weren't just wealthy business people. Many of them were family-oriented individuals who supported educational causes themselves. The most difficult part of Amy's research involved documenting Richard's pattern of humiliating behavior toward her. Amy had been so focused on trying to be the perfect wife that she had never thought to record or document the ways Richard treated her. But now, she began paying attention differently. Amy started using her phone to record conversations when Richard made degrading comments about her. She was careful to do this legally, recording in areas of their own home where she had every right to capture their interactions. It was painful to listen to these recordings later, but Amy knew they would be powerful evidence of Richard's true character. One evening, when Richard had a few business associates over for drinks, Amy recorded him referring to her as the help multiple times and making jokes about how she was basically a servant who lives here rent-free. The men laughed along, but Amy could hear some discomfort in their voices. She realized that while they went along with Richard's behavior, many of his colleagues were actually uncomfortable with how he treated his wife. After 2 weeks of preparation, Amy felt ready to execute her plan. She decided to host a dinner party at their home, inviting Richard's most important business contacts and their spouses. This would include James Peterson, the developer Richard was hoping to work with, along with Richard's current business partners and several potential clients. Amy presented the idea to Richard as a way to help his business relationships. "I know how important these connections are to you," she told him sweetly. "I thought it would be nice to have everyone over for an elegant dinner party. I could show off my cooking skills and you could strengthen your business relationships in a relaxed setting." Richard loved the idea immediately. He saw it as another opportunity to show off their beautiful home and demonstrate his success. "That's perfect," he said enthusiastically. "These are exactly the kind of people we need to impress. Make sure everything is absolutely perfect." Amy spent the entire week before the dinner party preparing every detail. She planned an elaborate menu, hired professional servers to help with the evening, and made sure their home looked flawless. She bought fresh flowers, had the house professionally cleaned, and even bought a new dress for the occasion. To anyone watching, it looked like Amy was simply being the perfect hostess, but Amy had also been preparing in other ways. She had organized all of Richard's incriminating documents into clear, easy-to-understand folders. She had prepared printed copies of the most damaging evidence, including bank statements showing the stolen charity money, emails about his divorce plans, and documentation of his hidden assets. Amy had even created a simple timeline showing how long Richard had been planning his betrayal. On the evening of the dinner party, 12 guests arrived at their home, including James Peterson and his wife, Richard's 3 business partners, and their spouses and 2 potential clients Richard had been courting. Everyone was dressed elegantly, and the atmosphere was warm and sophisticated. Amy played her role perfectly for the first hour. She was charming, gracious, and attentive to every guest's needs. The servers helped ensure that drinks were always full and appetizers were constantly available. Richard was in his element, talking business and making jokes, clearly enjoying being the center of attention in his beautiful home. During dinner, the conversation flowed easily. People complimented Amy's cooking, praised the beautiful table setting, and seemed to be having a wonderful time. Richard told stories about his business successes and made several comments about how lucky he was to have such good help at home. Referring to Amy, a few people looked uncomfortable with these comments, but most just smiled politely. After the main course was finished and before dessert was served, Amy stood up and asked for everyone's attention. "I'd like to propose a toast to my husband Richard," she said with a bright smile. Everyone raised their glasses expectantly, thinking this would be a loving tribute from a devoted wife. "Richard has taught me so much during our 8 years of marriage," Amy began, her voice clear and confident. "He's taught me about business, about success, and about what really matters to him." She paused, looking directly at Richard, who was beaming with pride. "For example, Richard has taught me that when you're trying to impress people, It's important to show them who you really are. Amy reached into a nearby cabinet and pulled out the folders she had prepared. So tonight I want to share with all of you exactly who Richard really is. The room fell silent as Amy opened the first folder. Richard often introduces me as his maid or servant, so I thought it was appropriate that I help him with some housekeeping tonight. She began distributing copies of documents to each guest. These are bank statements showing how Richard has been stealing money from the Children's Education Foundation for over 2 years. The guests stared at the papers in shock as Amy continued speaking calmly. The charity thought they were receiving $500,000 to help underprivileged children with their education. Instead, Richard took most of that money and invested it in his personal accounts. Richard's face had gone completely white. "Amy, what are you doing?" He stammered, but Amy continued without stopping. "Richard has also been planning to divorce me for months while hiding millions of dollars in assets," Amy said, distributing more documents. "He's been telling his lawyer that I'm worthless and unmotivated, while secretly moving our money into accounts I knew nothing about." James Peterson was reading the documents with a horrified expression. His wife had tears in her eyes as she looked at the charity information. The other guests were passing papers between them, their shock and disgust growing by the minute. Amy then pulled out her phone and played several recordings of Richard's most humiliating comments about her. The guests could hear Richard clearly calling Amy just the help and saying she was basically a servant who lives here for convenience. "These recordings were made in our home over the past few weeks," Amy explained. "This is how Richard talks about the woman he married, the woman who gave up her teaching career to support his dreams." The room was completely silent except for the sound of the recordings. When Amy finally turned off her phone, she looked around at the stunned faces of Richard's business associates. "I guess I really was just the help," Amy said with a calm smile. "I was helping Richard steal from children's charities. I was helping him hide assets from his wife. I was helping him present a false image to all of you." She paused and looked directly at Richard, who was sitting frozen in his chair. "But I'm done helping now." One by one, the guests began standing up and leaving without saying a word. James Peterson shook his head in disgust as he helped his crying wife to the door. Richard's business partners looked at him like they had never seen him before, their faces filled with anger and disappointment. Within 20 minutes, Amy and Richard were alone in their dining room, surrounded by the remnants of what was supposed to be a successful business dinner. Richard stared at Amy like she was a complete stranger. "How could you do this to me?" he whispered. Amy looked at her husband, really looked at him, for what she knew would be the last time. "I learned from the best," she said quietly. "You taught me that sometimes you have to show people who you really are." The woman Richard had dismissed as worthless had just destroyed his entire world with nothing more than the truth. The silence in the dining room after the last guest left was deafening. Richard sat at the head of their elegant dining table, staring at the scattered documents that had just destroyed his life. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking, slightly as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Amy stood calmly by the window, looking out at their perfectly manicured lawn, feeling a strange sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Richard finally whispered, his voice barely audible. He looked at Amy like she was a complete stranger, which in many ways she was. The submissive woman who had been silently enduring his abuse for years was gone, replaced by someone with strength and determination he had never seen before. Amy turned to face her husband, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt like she was looking down at him instead of up. "I know exactly what I've done," she said calmly. "I've told the truth about who you really are, something I should have done a long time ago." Richard's shock quickly turned to anger. "You've ruined everything. My business, my reputation, my future, all because you couldn't take a few harmless jokes." His voice was rising now, and Amy could see desperation creeping into his eyes. "Harmless jokes?" Amy repeated, her voice still calm but with an edge of steel. "Richard, you stole money from children's charities. You've been planning to divorce me while hiding millions of dollars. You've spent years humiliating me in front of people." None of that was harmless, and the next few days passed in a whirlwind of consequences that came faster than even Amy had expected. The first call came at 7 in the morning the day after the dinner party. It was from Robert Chun, one of Richard's biggest business partners, informing him that their partnership was immediately terminated. By noon, 2 more partners had called to end their relationships with Richard's company, James Peterson. The developer Richard had been so desperate to impress, didn't just withdraw his potential contract offer. He also contacted other business owners in their network to warn them about Richard's character and criminal behavior. In the construction industry, reputation was everything, and Richard's was now completely destroyed, but the business consequences were just the beginning. Amy had also sent copies of all the evidence to the Children's Education Foundation and to the State Attorney General's office. Within a week, investigators were examining Richard's financial records and interviewing charity officials about the missing donations. Amy watched all of this unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She took no joy in seeing Richard's life fall apart, but she felt a deep sense of justice knowing that his victims would finally get the help they deserved. The charity would recover their stolen money, and hopefully other women would see that they didn't have to accept abusive treatment from their husbands. The criminal investigation moved quickly once authorities realized the scope of Richard's fraud. The stolen charity money was easy to trace since Richard had been careless about hiding his tracks. He had been so confident that no one would ever discover his crimes that he hadn't bothered to cover them up properly. 3 weeks after the dinner party, Richard was arrested at his office on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and tax evasion. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the prominent businessman who had been stealing from children's charities while presenting himself as a generous philanthropist. Amy read the article while drinking her morning coffee, feeling like she was reading about a stranger rather than the man she had been married to for 8 years. While Richard was dealing with criminal charges, Amy was working with her own lawyer to file for divorce. Thanks to all the evidence she had gathered, her legal position was incredibly strong. Richard's attempts to hide assets actually worked in Amy's favor, as it showed the court that he had been deliberately trying to defraud her in their divorce proceedings. Amy's lawyer was amazed by the thoroughness of her documentation. "In 30 years of practicing family law, I've never seen a client come in so well prepared," he told her. "You've essentially done all the investigative work for us." The divorce proceedings were swift and decisive. Richard's lawyer tried to argue that Amy deserved minimal support since she hadn't worked in years, but the judge was not sympathetic. The evidence of Richard's planned deception, combined with Amy's sacrifices to support his career, resulted in a settlement that awarded Amy half of all assets, including the hidden accounts Richard had tried to keep secret. Amy also received their house, which she decided to sell. She didn't want to live surrounded by memories of her unhappy marriage, and she had bigger plans for her future. The house sold quickly to a young family who were excited about the beautiful property, and Amy felt good knowing it would be filled with love and laughter again. With her divorce settlement, Amy had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life, but she had no intention of just sitting around doing nothing. Her experience had awakened something in her that had been sleeping for years, a desire to help other people who were going through difficult situations. Amy's first project was establishing a foundation to help women who were leaving abusive marriages. She knew firsthand how difficult it could be to rebuild your life after years of being made to feel worthless and dependent. Her foundation provided financial assistance, legal support, and counseling services to women who needed help starting over. The foundation's first office was in a small building downtown, but Amy's vision was much bigger. She wanted to create a comprehensive support system that would help women not just leave bad marriages, but truly rebuild their lives with confidence and independence. Amy also decided to return to education, but in a different capacity than before. Instead of teaching elementary school, she began working with adult education programs, helping women who had never finished their schooling complete their degrees. Many of these women were in situations similar to what Amy had experienced. They had given up their education or careers to support their families and now needed help getting back on their feet. The work was incredibly fulfilling. Amy discovered that her years of marriage, even the difficult ones, had taught her valuable skills in organization, planning, and understanding people's needs. She was able to connect with women who felt lost and hopeless, helping them see that they had value and potential they might never have realized. 6 months after her divorce was finalized, Amy ran into one of Richard's former business associates at the grocery store. The man looked embarrassed when he saw her, clearly remembering the dinner party that had exposed Richard's crimes. "Amy, I just wanted to say how sorry I am about everything," he said awkwardly. "I had no idea Richard was treating you that way or that he was stealing from charities. If I had known ... Me smiled kindly at him. "You couldn't have known because Richard was very good at hiding who he really was. But thank you for saying that. It means a lot." As she drove home that day, Amy thought about how much her life had changed in less than a year. The woman who had once been afraid to speak up for herself was now running a foundation and helping other women find their strength. The person Richard had dismissed as worthless was making a real difference in the world. Amy had heard through mutual acquaintances that Richard was now working as a night security guard while he waited for his criminal trial. All of his assets had been frozen during the investigation, and he was living in a small apartment across town. The man who had once called her just a servant was now doing entry-level work, just to pay his bills and legal fees. Amy felt no satisfaction in Richard's downfall, but she did feel a deep sense of peace knowing that justice had been served. More importantly, she had discovered that the strength and intelligence Richard had tried to suppress in her were exactly the qualities that allowed her to build a meaningful life after their marriage ended. As Amy sat in her new home office one evening, reviewing applications for her foundation scholarship program, she smiled at the irony of her situation. Richard had spent years trying to make her feel small and unimportant, but his cruelty had ultimately led her to discover just how powerful she really was. The woman he had called worthless was now changing lives, while the man who had thought he was so important was paying the price for his crimes. Sometimes, Amy realized, the best revenge really was just living well and helping others do the same.